40 years ago, October 20th at 6:30 is about the time that we went down.
For decades, fans have treated the crash of Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane as one of rock's great unsolvable riddles, a tragedy wrapped in superstition, bad luck, and cosmic timing. But strip away the myth, and what's left isn't a mystery about fate. It's a mystery about people, the choices they made, the warnings they waved off, and the silence that followed. And once you look closely at what actually happened in that cockpit on October 20th, 1977, the answer isn't comforting. It isn't cosmic. It's something far more human and far harder to accept. By the autumn of 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd wasn't just another Southern rock act grinding out bar gigs. They were one of the biggest live draws in American music. Built around the gravel voice conviction of Ronnie Van Zant, the twin guitar interplay of Gary Rossington and Alan Collins, and a rhythm section that could turn a stadium into a revival tent. The band had spent years clawing their way out of Jacksonville, Florida, and into arenas across the country. Songs like Sweet Home Alabama, Simple Man, and the sprawling, cathartic Free Bird had become more than radio staples. They were rituals. Audiences didn't just listen to Skynyrd, they shouted for them, demanded encores, treated the shows like communal exorcisms. Their newest album, Street Survivors, released just 3 days before the crash, was being hailed as their most accomplished work yet. It introduced newcomer Steve Gaines, whose guitar work impressed even longtime critics of the band, and it debuted at a high chart position, seemingly confirming that Skynyrd's ascent was far from over. The album's original cover, the band standing calmly amid flames, was meant as a stylistic flourish, a nod to their fiery live reputation. Nobody involved could have imagined how differently that image would read within a week. Behind the music, though, was a punishing lifestyle. Skynyrd toured relentlessly, often playing city after city with almost no rest, chasing a work ethic that bordered on self-destruction. To keep up with the pace, the band had turned to chartered aircraft instead of buses, a decision that seemed practical at the time. It would prove to be the first domino in a chain nobody stopped to examine closely enough. The plane the band chartered for their fall tour was a Convair 240, a twin-engine propeller aircraft originally built in the late 1940s for short commercial hops. By 1977, the model was a relic. Most airlines had phased it out decades earlier in favor of jets, and the specific aircraft leased to Skynyrd had passed through a string of owners, accumulating tens of thousands of flight hours along the way. It wasn't inherently doomed simply by being old, but its maintenance history and the conduct of its flight crew left a great deal to be desired. What makes this detail sting in hindsight is that Skynyrd wasn't the first band offered this plane. According to multiple accounts from people close to the music industry at the time, another major rock act had considered chartering the very same aircraft earlier that year and had walked away after their team inspected it. Reports describe unease not just about the plane's mechanical condition, but about the crew's demeanor and habits during a pre-flight evaluation. Word of those concerns reportedly circulated informally within touring circles, the kind of industry whisper that should have reached the right ears before Skynyrd's people signed off on the same charter. Whether that warning ever reached the band's management in any formal way remains unclear. What is clear is that convenience won out. A grueling tour schedule, a Southern fan base the band refused to disappoint, and the sheer logistics of moving equipment and personnel across the map made an airplane, any airplane, an easier answer than another cross-country drive. The unease wasn't only external. During a flight just 2 days before the crash, passengers and crew noticed visible flames shooting from one of the engines. It was alarming enough that people on board began talking openly about ditching the plane. Cassie Gaines, sister of guitarist Steve Gaines and a background vocalist with the group, was reportedly frightened badly enough by the incident that she considered skipping future flights altogether and riding with the band's equipment truck instead. She was talked out of it. The band, in fact, had already begun making arrangements to lease a different aircraft, a more modern jet, for the remainder of the tour. That switch simply didn't happen in time. Long before the crash, those close to Ronnie Van Zant had noticed something unsettling in the way he talked about his own life. He wasn't morbid or dramatic about it. If anything, those who knew him described a strange calm whenever the subject came up. He told family members more than once that he didn't expect to live past 30. It wasn't framed as fear. It came across more like a private certainty he'd simply made peace with. That kind of statement, repeated enough times, tends to get filed away as a personality quirk until it stops being one. Van Zandt died at 29, weeks shy of the birthday he apparently never expected to see. His bandmates would later recall other offhand comments in the same vein, delivered with the same unbothered tone, as though he were describing weather rather than mortality. Those premonitions extend to Cassie Gaines as well. Her fear of that specific aircraft wasn't vague superstition. It followed a very real, very visible engine malfunction days before the fatal flight. She voiced it. She was overruled, gently but firmly, by people around her who reasoned that turning back wasn't really an option with the tour schedule they were locked into. None of this required the supernatural to be tragic. A fear rooted in something you personally witnessed isn't a premonition, it's a warning. The eerie part isn't that these moments happened, it's that they were treated as noise instead of signal. Here's where the story stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like a case study in preventable failure. When federal investigators pieced together what happened aboard that Convair 240 on the evening of October 20th, 1977, the explanation had nothing to do with structural collapse, explosion, or any of the dramatic mechanical failures fans often assume caused the crash. The finding was almost mundane in its simplicity, and that's exactly what makes it so hard to sit with. The aircraft ran out of fuel. Investigators determined that the flight crew had left the engines running on a fuel mixture, setting typically reserved for takeoff and climbing, a setting that burns through fuel far faster than the setting meant for cruising at altitude. Whether through inattention, unfamiliarity with the aircraft, or simple miscalculation, that switch to a more efficient setting was never made. Combine that with a right engine that had already been consuming fuel at an abnormal rate, the same engine that had been throwing sparks and flames days earlier, and the numbers stopped adding up long before anyone in the cockpit realized it. By the time the crew recognized how dire the fuel situation had become, there wasn't much room left to fix it. Attempts to divert to a nearby airport came too late. In a desperate scramble to rebalance dwindling fuel between tanks, the crew reportedly triggered a transfer that ended up venting what little fuel remained overboard rather than redistributing it. It was less an act of recklessness than a compounding series of small, human misjudgments, the kind that feel insignificant in isolation and catastrophic in sequence. This is the detail that reframes the entire tragedy. Fans have spent nearly 50 years treating the crash as an act of fate, an inexplicable tragedy visited upon a band that seemed cursed. But the NTSB's conclusion strips away that comfort. It wasn't fate. It was a cockpit crew that misjudged basic fuel management on an aircraft already flagged as questionable, flying a band that had already been warned, at least informally, by people who'd inspected the very same plane and walked away. By the time the aircraft's engines began failing, first the right, then the left, there wasn't panic in the traditional sense. Survivors described something closer to a heavy, resigned quiet settling over the cabin once it became clear what was happening. People held hands. Some closed their eyes. Ronnie Van Zandt, reportedly worn out from performing the previous night, had been sleeping through much of the flight and startled awake only as the severity of the situation became impossible to ignore. The plane went down in a densely wooded area near Gillsburg, Mississippi, tearing through trees for hundreds of feet before breaking apart. The impact killed Van Zandt, Steve Gaines, and Cassie Gaines, along with the pilots and others aboard. Survivors, including Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, Billy Powell, and drummer Artemus Pyle, were thrown from the wreckage or pinned inside it, badly injured, scattered across a swampy stretch of forest with no clear sense of who else had lived. Pyle, despite broken ribs, managed to free himself and set out through the woods in search of help. What followed was its own grim footnote to an already horrific night. Reaching a rural home in the dark and invisible distress, he was mistaken for an intruder and shot at before the homeowner understood what had actually happened. It took hours before rescue crews reached the site in full, and even longer before the scope of who had survived and who hadn't became clear to anyone, including the families waiting for news. The survivors carried the crash with them for the rest of their lives, in ways that went well beyond scar tissue. Gary Rossington, the only original member to keep performing with the band in later decades, suffered catastrophic injuries in the crash, and never fully recovered physically. He endured chronic pain and multiple surgeries for years afterward, eventually developing serious heart problems that required further operations, and he remained the band's last living founding member until his death in 2023. Leon Wilkeson's injuries were severe enough that rescue workers initially believed him dead. He returned to music with the band's later incarnation, but dealt with ongoing health problems for the rest of his life. Alan Collins, who helped write much of the band's most enduring material, faced his own devastating chapter years later when a car accident left him paralyzed, a tragedy compounded by the substance abuse he'd struggled with since the crash. He died in 1990. These weren't separate misfortunes unrelated to that night in Mississippi. They were, in large part, its long tail, the quiet, unglamorous cost of surviving something the public had already mythologized into legend. Even the way this story gets told has been a battleground. Decades after the crash, disputes over who had the right to depict it commercially spilled into court, pitting surviving members and grieving families against each other over old agreements about how the band's history could be used. It's a strange kind of aftershock, the tragedy itself long settled by investigators, but the ownership of its retelling still being argued over by the people who lived through it or lost someone in it. That tension says something honest about how these stories function. The public wants a clean narrative, cursed plain, doomed rock stars, tragic inevitability. The people who actually survived or lost family members are left managing something messier. Grief, blame, and the uncomfortable knowledge that better decisions, made just days or even hours earlier, might have changed everything. If you came looking for a supernatural explanation, a curse, a premonition fulfilling itself, a band simply too big and too bright to last, the actual record doesn't offer one. What it offers instead is a far less mystical and far more uncomfortable truth. An aging aircraft with a checkered reputation, a crew that mismanaged basic fuel procedure, a band exhausted by its own success and unwilling to pause the momentum long enough to fix a problem they already knew existed, and a series of small, ordinary human failures stacking up until there was no more room for error. That's the mystery solved. And it isn't good, because it means the crash wasn't inevitable. It means there were exits along the way. An aircraft that could have been declined, an engine issue that could have grounded the plane days earlier, a fuel setting that could have been checked and corrected mid-flight. None of those exits required hindsight to see. They were visible in real time, to the people who lived it, and still weren't enough to change the outcome. Nearly 50 years later, Lynyrd Skynyrd's music still fills stadiums, still closes out road trips, still gets shouted for at concerts that have nothing to do with them. Free Bird remains one of the most requested songs in rock history. But underneath the legend is a far plainer story than the one usually told. Not a band undone by fate, but one undone by a string of decisions that, individually, must have felt small enough to overlook. That's the part of this story that doesn't fade with the myth. Not a curse, not destiny, just a series of warnings that went unheeded until there was nothing left to warn anyone about.